Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So the first topic that I wanted to get on is this so-called skills gap. In the coverage that the Journal puts out every Wednesday on careers and workplace issues, there's been a lot about a so-called skills gap. Do you think a skills gap exists in the economy? And if so, is it specialized in certain industries?
If you talk to employers, they will definitely tell you that a skills gap exists, and probably many of you see one in your own hiring and recruiting. I think it's more complicated than that. For one thing, there's no doubt that skills are evolving in this economy much faster than they have in the past, particularly in technology. I had an interesting interview with the CEO of Elance, which is an online work platform, a while ago for freelancers. And he was saying that for the most in-demand skills he sees, there's a turnover of 2 to 3 years, before a new software language becomes popular or becomes necessary for the kind of web programming that a lot of people are looking for. So in technology, there is certainly a very fast turnover and evolution, and that is creating perhaps a skill gap. But you talk to a lot of economists and even some business people, and they are extremely skeptical of that idea. They'll say, employers will say, I can't find the people I need or find the people with the skills I need, but they're leaving off the end of that sentence, which is at the price I want to pay for them. And that is basic economics. You raise the wages for a job, and eventually you'll find an equilibrium. Workers will go and get the training that they need to have those skills, or companies will get to the point where they're desperate and they need to offer the training. So there is reason to be skeptical there. And in fact, I was speaking to an economist yesterday who did a paper about manufacturing, where we often hear complaints about a skills gap. And to some extent, there are legitimate concerns there. Manufacturing has been so stripped down in this country because of outsourcing and automation that I think you find very few younger people seeing it as a viable career. As a result, you do have fewer people who have the CNC machinery skills, the type of sort of high-end manufacturing skills. And I think that is an issue. But again, if the wages were high enough, people would go and get the training themselves. And we have had a long-term problem in this country, long-term meaning at least in the last decade or so, even before this recession, where wage growth is much slower than inflation and other costs of everything else seem to be going up much faster than wages. So again, if employers were to pay more, you would see greater equilibrium there. What I also find interesting is a question of, so let's say there's a skills gap. Whose job is it to fix that? Is it government through an education system? Is it employers through training their own workers? Is it individuals through getting their own training? And I think we see that responsibility or burden shifting to individuals more and more, and coding schools, which are a big trend that I just wrote about, are evidence of that. And I think this question of should employers be doing more training is really interesting. They've stopped doing that to a great extent. I mean, companies are still spending a lot of money on development and training, as I'm sure you all know, but there's a lot less intensive training, partly because of a slack labor market. I think companies assume that they should be able to hire people right into a job to start off, knowing what they're doing. And that's not always the case. On the other hand, they're reluctant to invest in the training, and you often see training being one of the first costs that's cut. I think that's one of the things, transferring this risk to individuals to go and get the training that they need. And that may not work. Not everybody has the ambition, the flexibility, the mental agility to go and be retrained every time the economy sort of demands or looks for a new set of skills. And I think we'll see more and more companies, especially as the economy gets better and the labor market gets better, realizing they have to invest in that. And I'm actually working on a story right now about a company in Chicago that just created a very expensive and intensive informal apprenticeship program where they pulled 4 of their best workers off their production line and are spending 2 years paying them full salaries, doing nothing but training them, classroom training, on-the-job training, and it's a fascinating program, and it's very expensive. They're a private company, they're family held, and they don't answer to shareholders. It makes that a little bit easier.
One real quick follow-up to that. there was a story in the Journal, I think it was a month and a half ago, about corporations starting to get more directly involved investing in undergraduate education. You hear a lot about the diminishing value of a liberal arts education, and that, frankly, college graduates just don't have fundamental skills of operating in a corporate environment. Do you think that it's wise for corporations to get more directly involved, whether it's financing undergraduate business school programs or things like that?
I think it is to a certain extent, and certainly those companies know best the skills that people need to have coming out of school. Certainly when I was a liberal arts graduate, no one ever said to me, what are you going to do with your life? Or said, here are the skills that will be required in the economy that you're graduating into. I think it's a good thing. Of course, you don't want to get to the point where companies are dictating curriculum, especially for something like a liberal arts education where it's not vocational training. It's meant to be sort of mind expansion and critical thinking skills and those quote unquote softer skills that companies also say they want. But those kinds of partnerships, I think, can be very effective. Of course, they're expensive. They take a lot of time to think through what works best. There's got to be sort of again educational independence for the institution. That's much more common at community college levels where it is more vocational training, and it is interesting that it's starting to happen now at four-year colleges.
Interesting. Another big topic that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds, performance management. Obviously, the last couple of years, we've seen Microsoft ditch stack ranking. We've seen Adobe kind of go to a frequent check-in process. And at the same time, we've seen Yahoo kind of implement stack ranking. And there seems to be counter-arguments for both. What's your take on what you've observed on how companies are measuring performance?
Mm-hmm. Well, my company's about to do performance evaluations, and I asked our head of HR, we're not given a ranking, but I asked our head of HR if we're actually secretly given rankings and, that we don't see, that the employees don't see, and he kind of hedged, so I'm still not sure. But, I think this is a fascinating area, partly because of the way technology is getting involved in this issue of performance management. I think it's something that's really on a lot of companies' minds. It probably always has been, but I think companies, especially in this sort of lean, stripped down, lean operations kind of environment, are really thinking a lot more about how do we connect company-wide productivity with individual performance. And stack ranking is fascinating. Jack Welch came in and he brought it to GE. But he came into a bloated organization. I mean, this is what he says, and experts seem to agree. That needed a certain amount of culling, and cleaning up. And he, I think, later also disavowed stack ranking. I think he felt that it was the right thing at the time that he arrived, but not necessarily as an operating strategy in terms of performance management. There are a lot of clear criticisms of stack ranking, that it ends up with managers playing favorites, or, it ends up not being an objective system. And what if you've got a really high performing team and you still have to fire two of your people? That's not good business. So the stuff that I'm interested in with performance management is companies are really looking at ways to do it on a more frequent basis, real-time, continuous. And technology is enabling that because a lot of the vendors that I get pitched constantly by HR technology vendors, and that stuff is really interesting. It's hard to know how far it's penetrating into the marketplace, but these systems that allow people to input their goals and update their goals constantly, and then it gives a lot of visibility for your manager can go in and once a week look at where you are with your goals. Of course, you have to be engaging with the technology and updating it constantly, and I don't know that you can assume that you'll get that kind of engagement from your employees. But I find it fascinating because I think it gets harder and harder to hide in this economy. If you're a low or mid performer, your manager can be constantly looking over your shoulder. Now, we don't have this yet at the Wall Street Journal, but if I was supposed to set a goal, in January saying I was going to have 6 page one stories and 12 blog posts a month and this and that, that would really freak me out, because work doesn't work like that. And of course you can constantly update, et cetera. But I think it's a tool for monitoring people, and if you're, again, you can't hide if you're not sort of meeting those constant goals. But what's interesting, when I talk to both vendors and companies using this software, they say, well, it's not really about finding the low performers faster and firing them faster. I sort of suspect it is kind of used for that. But they said it's more about finding who the bad managers are, less about the employees and more about seeing who are the managers who are not developing their talent, who are not having difficult conversations with their employees, who are not managing, and managing to better performance. So, I think that's an interesting take on it.
I think another topic that has been brought up a number of times this morning, engagement. As a reporter, it can be a frustrating topic to cover because engagement is always sort of the panacea for every problem. But then again, nobody really knows how to measure it. I mean, Gallup does their study every year. That's one measure that's highly relied upon. But then you see 3 more studies that kind of contradict what they say. What's your topic of what's your take on engagement, and should HR leaders be more skeptical of it as a measure of something they should strive towards?
Well, it's hard for me not to roll my eyes when I hear the term engagement, only because it's a buzzword. It's not without value. But you mentioned Gallup. Is anybody here from Gallup? I don't know if that was a yes or no, but I sometimes suspect that Gallup invented this term and sells its consulting services around their survey. Their 30% figure, they said, I think last year, that 30% of American workers are engaged at work, 70% are disengaged. And that's the one that I see that's most widely cited, but I see many more surveys that say more like 50 to 60% are engaged. I mean, what does engagement mean? And I wonder, why do we use that term instead of employee satisfaction or motivation, words that are a little bit more less jargony. And I've long been a skeptic of this idea, partly because I think companies want, naturally, reasonably, and expect their employees to be engaged at the same time that in many ways they're treating them worse. And by that I mean on a sort of very long-term basis, and I think we'll get to this later, but you see sort of aspects of the employee-employer contract being just kind of frayed. We don't have pensions anymore. Companies are starting to talk about not offering health insurance, although I think we're a long way away from that. All the things that used to be the things that helped you feel you were being taken care of as an employee, and therefore you responded with loyalty and what we might call engagement. I think it's less and less of a two-sided dynamic now, especially if you're not a star. If you're a star, you're fine no matter what, and your company's going to try to keep you. But for ordinary mortals, so I think this idea that companies want and expect us to be engaged, and my company just did an engagement survey, which I found interesting, and it was interesting for me to go through that exercise myself since I read about and write about these things. It's a lot to expect from people. Now, somebody can be a great employee without necessarily being engaged in the sense of putting in discretionary effort, working late or whatever. Or not planning to leave. Even if you're planning to leave, you can or want to leave, you can still be a very good employee. But I will say the thing that kind of turned me around a little bit on the engagement issue was, you may all be New Yorkers here, but there were a couple of children who died in a fire in the Rockaways a few months ago. And what happened was that the emergency medical response, the people at 911, didn't respond to the phone calls from the fire department that said, we need ambulances, we need medical personnel. And they just weren't answering the calls for some reason. And it took something like 7 minutes to get the ambulances there when it should have taken 2. And 2 children died. And it turned out that the employees who were not answering the phone had been cited in the past for poor performance. And you got to think, okay, is that incompetence or is that disengagement? And if it's disengagement, then you can see how engagement is a serious issue. And that sort of made me think differently about it. I mean, I hope they're not incompetent, but in that case, it's tragic that they were disengaged. So I'm a little less skeptical now.
As you mentioned, the employer-employee social contract is another thing I wanted to address with you. What is your take on how that's changing? You mentioned, something like health insurance being stripped away. Where, based on your reporting, do you see that social contract heading?
Nowhere good. I see it in my job, and I see it from the people that I speak to. There's just that contract, that relationship of loyalty and trust is really, it's really thin right now. It's a very weak bond. And that is for good and bad reasons. Individuals have more mobility to go where they want, and to, take a better job offer. And they're not tied to a place where they don't want to be, or that's not the best place for them because they don't want to lose their pension, or they don't want to lose their health insurance, or they just have a sort of sense of entitlement to that job. So people can move around, and I'm a bit of a job hopper, so I've benefited from some of that, going to the next better opportunity. But there's a lot of downsides for individuals in the sense of insecurity, and I think in the end this is not a good thing for individuals or employers. Employers lose a lot of talent. They lose a lot of knowledge when people don't feel connected to the organization. They don't get the quote-unquote engagement. They don't get the best performance from people who don't feel motivated, who feel taken for granted. I see that a lot. I think individuals feel very taken for granted at the companies that they're in. And this company that I mentioned where they're doing this apprenticeship program, they seem to be operating on an old-fashioned model. Many of the people there have been there for 30 or 40 years, production workers. They're doing this apprenticeship partly because they realize they have a lot of older employees and they're going to be retiring at some point. But, it's a company where they pay above market rate for wages, even in a bad economy. They recognize that they can't hire for skills because they make high-end dental equipment, and who learns that in school, So they hire for, attitude and fit, and then they recognize, okay, we do a long training process with every employee, not just these apprentices. But I think the paying the higher wages, they've got a really good set of benefits and a really good culture. And of course, that's a very amorphous thing and tough to create a great culture if there isn't one when you're coming in, and especially as companies get bigger. But, this is a company that gets rewarded. They have very low turnover. They have incredible employee loyalty. And I think a lot of companies just can't count on that anymore. And, I think there is a very big difference between a company with public, that's public and has shareholders to answer for. You see more and more decisions being made based on the finances. And I was recently just talking to somebody from Mercer yesterday about this, who does benefits consulting, and he was talking about, just the role of the finance team in HR decisions is getting bigger and bigger. And I wrote a story a few months ago with a colleague about outplacement services and how outplacement has been, the contracts are shorter, people have less, fewer months of outplacement service, much more of it is going online, it's not the one-on-one. Often you're dealing with a counselor who's in an entirely other city who doesn't know your job market. Those decisions are being made more and more by the procurement department rather than HR, especially if there's private equity investors who are just really intensely focused on cutting costs. So, that kind of thing, that kind of dynamic, I think, is at play in a lot of places, and it's really hurting that relationship, between employer and employee.
Well, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions for Lauren. If anyone in the audience wants to take a stab, please raise your hand very high. Here we go. We got one.
So my question is around performance management and decoupling performance and compensation. Because as employees look at it, if I don't score or rank X, I'm not going to get my increase. So as a result, it's almost like they're gamifying the system. So my question is, do you see kind of a trend moving towards decoupling the compensation and performance management rather than right now they seem to be linked?
Yeah, I do see that from the people I talk to and from the employers I talk to as well. I think that also comes from research that shows that pay is not necessarily the best driver of retention and engagement. There's that word again. So I think companies, and partly this comes out of a lot of research about millennials and what they're looking for, which I'm also tend to be a little skeptical of that stuff. Who knows? Maybe millennials will change their tune once they start getting married and having kids, and pay will become a bigger driver of some of these things. But a lot of the research says that they want to see opportunity, they want to see a career path, they want to see learning opportunities and things like that. So I think companies are trying to figure out how to use their performance management systems more to enable those types of opportunities than necessarily figuring out what your bonus is going to be. Also, those bonus or pay raise bands tend to be very small. I mean, okay, one person gets 1.5%, and the guy who ranks higher gets 2%. It's like, I think that's just not that meaningful to a lot of people.
Anyone else? We have time for about one more. Going once? Oh, here we go. I knew if I said it again.
So you talked about the concept of employee engagement and the fact that it's sort of a vague measure, but I think we all know that there are challenges, and companies are challenged to engage or improve their employee experience. So based on the conversations that you're having, what do you think companies should be looking at, and how do you think companies should be trying to make a difference? If what the question of engagement off the table, what do you think they should be doing?
Well, I'm old-fashioned, so I would say things that relate to financial security. If people feel like they're being paid adequately for what they do, if when I think about myself, just my company has great benefits, and it's a real incentive to stay. My company's pretty good about family-friendly policies. I have a young child, so that makes a big difference to me. I think it differs for different people and at different stages of life. But, I got pitched something about a story, which I think is really interesting, about how more companies are bringing people with marketing experience into HR. And bringing that sort of idea of customer insight into HR for employee insight. What do our employees want? Like, what do our customers want? And I kind of find it funny because, maybe people just want job security, but that's something that's valuable now. That's valuable after a recession where a lot of people saw coworkers be cut, and where they don't know if they're going to be the next one on the block. So. I think, like I said, I'm old-fashioned. I think people want pretty basic things: job security, decent pay, and good benefits. When I think about what's important to me, it's that kind of thing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lauren. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.